When we think about horror, we often focus on the grisliest details. Severed limbs, bloody fangs, broken bodies. Horror, perhaps more than any other genre, deliberately evokes strong, typically negative emotions like fear, anger, and sadness. It is rare that we consider the role that joy plays in horror, in our creation and consumption of horror narratives. So much so, in fact, that it seems more likely that we would judge anyone who enjoys such images as morally bankrupt. But there is something that does not ring true about this image when we look at the people in the horror community. From horror creators to horror fans, the idea that some dark cloud of despair hangs over anyone interested in horror seems demonstrably false. In fact, there seems to be a general sense of joy in and among this community, which begs the question, how can we understand the contrast between horror and joy? And what does it mean to take joy in something horrific?
In part, this podcast will work to answer that question. It will likely take some twists and turns along the way, but our hope is that by talking to horror creators, by discussing our own experiences, and by interacting with you, our listeners, we can come to understand how horror and joy work together. Joy, distinct from pleasure or even happiness, is a positive emotion that allows us to stand outside of ourselves, to be momentarily above the concerns of everyday existence. Horror allows us to imagine our world right now with some impossible thing transgressing our understanding of reality. In some way, horror rips us out of our world and thrusts us right back into it. In doing so, it allows us to re-evaluate our world, to take stock of our values, and to see reality differently. There is joy in that process, joy in the destruction of our world in hopes that something new can emerge, joy in gaining a new perspective on our already broken world, and joy in imagining a world that has moved beyond our current horrors. Along the way, we want to be careful about discussing joy in the imagined trauma that mirrors real trauma. Instead, we hope that our discussions of horror bring out the joy of understanding how that trauma impacts our world and how we can work to think differently about our situation. Our goal is to celebrate the joys of horror along with you. So come along if you dare. And remember, seek joy, even in horror.
This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona. We're excited to bring you a new podcast called Horror Joy. We know that there are a lot of horror podcasts out there, so we wanted to start off by describing why we're doing this. So, Brian, why are we doing this?
Yeah, for me, there are two big reasons. First, I've noticed that I experience a sense of joy when I'm reading horror or when I'm watching horror or when I'm thinking about horror or playing games that have to do with horror. And so when I realized this, I thought, this is kind of strange. We just don't associate horror with joy very often. But looking around at the way that horror fans, artists, authors, directors, and those who generally are in the horror community and how they talk about horror, it just seemed to me that this was a kind of common experience. And I wanted to explore that here, right, out loud. And second, while there are a lot of horror podcasts out there, I think we offer a unique perspective on horror, coming from the kind of molding halls of academia. I think the hope is that we can offer discussions and insights that don't get a lot of attention in the horror podcast universe. What do you think? What is the relationship between horror and joy for you, Jeff?
I'm going to second everything you said there, like give it a +1, as they say. But I'll add, I think there's a sense of joyful relief watching horror rather than experiencing it. There is some sort of physiological, psychological response that we have to seeing others in these horrific situations that recognizes that that's not us in such danger. Beyond that, I think witnessing these moments can also trigger an empathetic adrenaline response of sorts, which likely releases chemicals in the body or some such science stuff I don't really know or understand.
Yeah, I like that. I think all of those things are true. And it kind of reminds me of Noel Carroll's claim that horror is unique in that when we watch it, as the audience, we are mimicking the emotional state of the characters. It also reminds me of the Magic Circle. There's this sense in which we're safe when we watch or we play or we read horror. And there are moments when that kind of breaks down, but we have to remind ourselves. So I like that sense of relief that like, that's the horror going on. I'm safe inside the Magic Circle. And I think I think something that we can kind of explore further too as we go along is when the magic circle is broken, whether or not horror can shine a light on the world we live in. So we're not just mirroring the world anymore, that the horror is now impacting us in a way that we can take from our experiences with horror. How did you initially get into horror?
Well, as an English professor, I think I'm supposed to say a book. But no, it was the movies. In particular, the old horror movies they'd run on television around Halloween. So, them, The Blob, Frankenstein, all of the over the top ones shot in black and white or like early Technicolor, have that very 50s and 60s vibe to them. Eventually, my mom introduced my brother and I to Alfred Hitchcock's particular brand of psychological horror in The Birds and Psycho. This could explain a lot of why I am the way I am, really. And The Dark Crystal from the 80s as well. I don't know if we consider that horror, but traumatic movies that have shaped me. Add that to the list. As a Scholastic Book Fair kid, I obviously owned and read every Goosebumps book that came out in the 90s. I think the particular type of horror actually informs a lot of the movies in the late 90s, but we'll talk about that some other episode maybe. There were some other young adult horror light or horror adjacent books I read. The Bunnicula books come to mind. Eventually I found Stephen King too, but it'd be disingenuous for me to say it wasn't movies that got me into horror. What about you?
I think that I resonate with the idea that Goosebumps kind of got me into horror. I did not watch a lot of horror when I was younger, but the Goosebumps books, I absolutely love them. I love the mystery in them and the friendship in them. I've even read some to my kids, right? And I think they're legitimately creepy. Even
Mhm.
now, I read one of them about a mask, and at the end, I was like, that was kind of creepy. So for me, it was books. It was Goosebumps. And I got a hold of, I can't even name them now, but I got a hold of a few short story horror collections that I probably shouldn't have read, but I know that they scared me so much. So straight from Goosebumps, I went to Stephen King. So we have that in common. And I love Stephen King even to this day. My mom signed me up for the subscription. I could get a hardcover book every month. And so I read a ton of King early on. And so fiction was my entry into horror. And I don't think that I really liked horror movies until much later. And I don't know when that happened. I love movies and I've loved movies for a very long time, but I think I gravitated towards science fiction. I remember going to see the Blair Witch Project in high school and then The Grudge, the Sarah Michelle Gellar movie, sometime in college. And again, I didn't watch a lot of horror movies back then, but somewhere along the way, I think the love of horror in fiction got me watching horror films. So I've had a lot of making up to do. I've only recently seen like Nightmare on Elm Street and those kind of slasher movies, Halloween, The Leprechaun I saw when I was younger. But yeah, I've only recently kind of caught up to these other kinds of movies. So I have some opinions on them. I think that may clash with some other folks that have been part of the horror community watching horror movies for a lot longer. And I'd love to talk about that, why I think what I think, and I'd love to hear from other people why they think what they think. So I watch a lot of horror movies now, but there's a large back catalog of classic horror that I haven't seen and I'm catching up. Is there any specific movie maybe recently that you've seen that has really resonated with your understanding of horror and even a sense of joy that you got from watching it?
You mentioned Blair Witch Project, and my husband and I just watched the other night a movie called Willow Creek, and it's another found footage movie. The director is apparently pretty famous. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but it's essentially another found footage film that is a couple going after Bigfoot in the like remote-ish wilderness of Washington. The whole Blair Witch Project premise terrifies me, having grown up sort of in a rural area. There are woods pretty much everywhere you can see, and camping was part of my childhood. So the idea of getting out in the woods and getting lost and having some sort of like supernatural thing find you is horrifying. So seeing a movie where that's not happening to you, it does sort of scratch that itch, as they say, to horrify you personally. But there is that immense relief, as we've been talking about, to realize it's not me. The found footage movies do sort of discomfit me a little more than, say, something like a Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street or, obviously like The Blob or Them or something. But thinking to like the more recent movie, Immaculate, I don't know if that resonated with me, but like that definitely was a decent film that has a lot to say. And that's, to me, more of like where you find joy in horror, where it's very clearly not you that it's happening to. Maybe almost speaking from a position of privilege as I think through this, because like it's not something that could happen to me, given that it and those that movie and then another recent one, The First Omen, it's happening to a female body. So yeah, there is something maybe there to unpack a bit that I hadn't thought through quite yet. You anything recent?
One, I did look up Willow Creek, and it's Bobcat Goldthwait,
Yep.
who in my head, I don't associate him with horror. I think when I was a kid, he was like this comedian around. And so that's really interesting. I am now interested in this movie. I think one thing that you said about the Blair Witch Project is interesting. I grew up in Southern California. We had to go somewhere to go to the woods. They were not in our backyard. And so I think that film resonated with me a little bit more, not in the sense that it was in my backyard, but that there are places out there like this. And I think I might want to avoid them. Having now found myself in central Pennsylvania, I wonder about that. There's a little woods in the back of our house, and I sometimes look out after taking out the trash or whatever at night, and I think, what if there was somebody out there? What would I do if I just saw somebody in the woods right now?
Going back inside.
Yes, that's exactly right. So for me, there are these films kind of fairly recently that have really grabbed me. This is where I find joy, I think, now as an academic, is thinking through the big ideas that horror offers to us. And something like It Follows was so compelling to me, not only because there was this storyline about a sexually transmitted ghost or something, but the sense of existential dread is built up so well that two things happen. One, we kind of find ourselves in a place that we have no way to ground ourselves. And there's something about horror that does that for me. And it makes me think about my own experience of the world around me. But two, it makes me think of these kinds of experiences of impending doom that are expected. We know that they're going to come around the corner, something like adulthood, any kind of major event in your life. And when I've talked to my students about this movie, this is the thing that I try to have them see, is that in some way, this is the way that horror can influence our understanding of our own selves. And so It Follows is one that I think really has resonated with me for a while. There's lots of others, and we're going to have time to talk about that as we go. But that's the one that kind of pops out.
The collections you were talking about, the fiction collections of horror stories, they wouldn't happen to have been scary stories to tell in the dark, were they?
I did have those, but there were, I can't even remember. It was a really slim volume. And there are two stories that I remember. There was one where there was a guy in a cabin, and there was some creature that kept getting in. And again, I didn't grow up in a cabin. We didn't go to cabins. We camped on the beach. But there was something so scary about that. Again, I don't know why I was reading this at such a young age, but somebody had to sneak into a castle, and so they had to wear somebody else's skin. And that kind of thing, it just scared me so much. And now thinking about it, it's like, oh, how are you performing for other people? And are you hiding yourself? And that kind of thing, right? I think there's lots to say about that. But those are the things that I still think about to this day.
I was just curious. I'm thinking those are pretty iconic anthologies from, again, like Scholastic Book Fair Kid, The Big Toe Story, where they make soup out of the big toe. Some of those were kind of traumatic in a way. Like they were illustrated in a borderline Shel Silverstein kind of cartoonish way, but the stories themselves, when you stop and think about it, you're like, there's some very dark stories in these books that are out of potentially the fairy tale tradition. And if you look at like some of these fairy tales, it's Brothers Grimm, out of the German tradition, not the sanitized American ones, but they're probably horror, frankly, a lot of those fairy tales.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one thing that we want to do here in this podcast is to talk about those experiences. We had those experiences as kids, and we kept going back to them because we liked it. There was something about it that we really liked. And now, as academics, I think we can start to unpack some of that stuff while at the same time reliving that feeling of joy, right? So it's like it feels as if we're kind of down this nostalgic road, but I think that's exactly where we want to be is we've had experiences of joy with horror, and now, we're stuffy academics, but maybe we can kind of think through those kinds of experiences so that maybe we can, dust off our stuffiness a little bit and take joy in the horror that we've experienced.
Yeah, and beyond that stuffy academicness, I don't know if I'm gonna co-sign that one. I'm pretty hip and cool, but there are many things about horror that people just stop at the horror, right? And what we're trying to do here is get beyond just being scared and finding that getting scared is fun, because you can do that in an amusement park if you want to go on a roller coaster or something. There are things horror does productively that I think some of the academic background we both have can bring to bear on what a certain horror movie's doing, what it might be commenting on, how it's sort of fitting within the context of the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, right after the war in Iraq, right after 9/11, during the financial crisis of 2008, during the women's reproductive health crisis we're currently going through in this country. So some of our background, now that we are older and stuffier, I guess, we have that sort of knowledge that hopefully we can share and get other people thinking about these things productively.
Donna Haraway says, it matters what stories tell stories. And I think it matters how we're telling the story of right now, how we're telling the story of climate change, war, anxiety, wealth gap, all of that, I think can be found productively, like you said, in horror. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to try to do. We're going to find joy in horror. But like you said, we're not going to stop at the being scared. We want to find joy in those ideas. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.